We begin the day with the numbers needed to wage and win a war. Israel says its military has enough weapons and munitions to press ahead with an offensive in the southern Gaza city of Rafah. Now, this comes after a warning from U.S. President Joe Biden that Washington could cut some weapons exports to Israel if the offensive goes ahead. The fear, of course, massive civilian casualties in Rafah. Well, tens of thousands of people are thought to be leaving Rafah, looking for safe haven, and for most, this is not the first time that they've had to do this.
Fleeing the fighting in Rafah, the Kafana family is once again on the move. They're headed to Khan Yunis, but fear what they will find there.
Khan Yunis area is safe, but there's no life there. They tell us to go to Khan Yunis. Okay, so it's a safe place, but it doesn't have any water or any food or drink or aid or anything. We don't know what to do.
Israel had previously labelled Rafah as a safe zone. More than 1 million people have been sheltering there. Now it's Israel's latest battle zone. It says the city is a stronghold for Hamas militants. Tanks patrol eastern districts, and airstrikes are escalating, with children among the victims.
The Israeli army struck us with 2 missiles, without warning. This is a criminal act. 8 people were martyred. Among them were little children who had nothing to do with any of this.
Further restrictions on aid are making life even worse. Israel has shut off the vital Rafah border crossing, leaving supply warehouses virtually empty and bringing hospitals to the brink of collapse.
The most important elements, what we all need humanitarian, is fuel. Fuel, fuel, fuel. Then, of course, also for humanitarian aid, but also staff movement and medevac. So I want to stress again, without fuel, all the humanitarian operations, including hospital operation, they come to a halt. In the south, our estimation is that the hospitals only have fuel for 2 to 3 days left.
The United States has repeatedly warned Israel against a full-scale offensive in Rafah and has halted some arms deliveries. Israel, though, remains defiant and shows no signs of giving in to international pressure.
All right, let's get some more analysis now with Marina Miron. She's from the War Studies Department at King's College London. Marina, it's good to see you again. So, I'll start by just asking you, do we know, has the invasion of Rafah, has it begun?
Good evening, Brent. Well, that's a great question because there is some unclarity in terms of what the IDF is doing. It seems like it's having some clashes in eastern Rafah with Hamas militants. However, we cannot say that the full-scale incursion of Rafah has already started. And some opine that this might be a way to push Hamas to actually agree to Israeli conditions of the deal for a ceasefire. So it might be something like a show of force, which is, of course, complicating Israel's position on an international stage, given the fact that the U.S. wants to limit its arms shipments to Israel if that operation is to take place.
If it goes beyond being a show of force, and we're talking about a full-fledged invasion, a ground offensive against Rafah, how do you foresee it progressing?
It will be very difficult for the IDF, and I know that Israel said that it would be very surgical and very targeted. However, it seems like an oxymoron in an urban environment to have a targeted operation because the IDF would have to operate amongst civilians with Hamas militants most likely dressed in civilian clothes. So it's very difficult to distinguish them from regular civilians on the one hand. On the other hand, the threat would be coming from anywhere. So this is a multi-directional threat. They will have to go very slowly, section by section, bearing in mind that there is always a possibility of collateral damage, and there will be essentially collateral damage because we know the Israeli IDF is using air force as well as artillery. So it will be a very slow and painful operation, and I think the best approach for the IDF would be going sections by sections and trying to move civilians somehow out of the way. But there is no good approach, and I don't think they have a real plan as at this stage.
And what about the role of the United States, and particularly the warning from U.S. President Biden that if you do go into Rafah, the United States may hold back some of its weapons shipments to Israel. Is that going to change Israel's abilities at all in an offensive against Rafah?
Absolutely. I think it will be very impactful because as for now, Israel still has enough munitions to hold the north and to conduct its limited operations around Rafah. However, if the U.S. is not to supply Israel, from an Israeli point of view, they see it as an existential fight which could be lost because they will not have enough munitions in order to pursue the remaining 4 Hamas battalions in Rafah. So that could potentially cripple the entire operation from the Israeli perspective.
Let's assume that the weapons are there in the number needed. Israel says that Rafah is home to Hamas's last remaining battalions. Do you agree with what we're hearing from Israel, that Rafah really would be Hamas's last stand?
It is a very good question. I don't know what kind of intelligence Israel has on the numbers that are still left, but we know that the IDF has just now closed the crossing with Egypt. So there was this assumption that Hamas was getting its weapons from Egypt. Therefore, I think it's very likely that some Hamas fighters might have escaped as well and have occupied other locations outside of the Gaza Strip. So in theory, if it's all sealed off, at least the Hamas fighters who are in Rafah could be eliminated by Israeli armed forces. However, we don't know if we're talking about the entirety of Hamas. And we also have to understand that the cause might live on and others might take up arms in name of Hamas. Yeah,
that's a good point. What happens, though, if Israel says that it is going to achieve its goal of completely destroying Hamas, and it's going to do that, but it's going to need weapons, enough weapons? If it says that to the United States, in your professional opinion, can you imagine the United States withholding weapons and letting Israel not achieve the goal of destroying Hamas?
Well, I think the United States is in a very difficult position, and I think Jordan has expressed these concerns because the United States, on the one hand, is supporting Israel and is willing to send weapons. On the other hand, they are criticizing Israel for what is happening in Rafah and in Gaza in humanitarian terms. So I think that, especially pre-election, it will be a very difficult choice in terms of how the United States might resolve this situation. But I think they will have to try and exert enough pressure on Israel in order to resolve the humanitarian situation first before any military action can take place. And I see U.S. involvement in this specific operation as well in a humanitarian role. And I think that might be a way forward in order to get around this, as not to endanger Israel's survival, which is from Israeli perspective is what it is, what it's fighting for in Gaza, and without risking the lives of all those civilians who are trapped in Gaza.
Marina Miron from King's College London. Marina, as always, we appreciate your time and your insights tonight. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
I'm joined now by Laura Blumenfeld. She is a Middle East analyst. She served in the U.S. State Department as a senior policy advisor for that region, and she joins me tonight from Washington, D.C. Laura, it's good to Have you back on the program with us. U.S. President Biden says that the United States will withhold more weapons if Israel mounts this ground operation in Rafah. I'm wondering, how big is this stick? I mean, is this enough to make Israel back down?
I mean, from Biden's point of view, this is like a friends don't let friends drive drunk moment. He's taking away the keys, so to speak. For Netanyahu, he's standing on the side of the road and saying, "I still got to get home, and we'll do it with or without you." As the Israelis have abandonment issues. Netanyahu spoke about that. Right to that point, on Holocaust Memorial Day, he gave a speech this week where he said, there were times when the Jews stood alone in the world, no one came to our aid, and we will not be defenseless again. So he's really driving hard, Netanyahu, on this period of holidays. They call it the Days of Awe, which start on Holocaust Memorial Day. They take you up to Memorial Day for soldiers, right up to Israel Independence Day. So he's kind of working with that calendar to make a political point, which of course has military implications.
Yeah, the military implications here. Biden has said that the United States will not withhold defensive weapons like those used for Israel's Iron Dome, for example. Could that change?
Of all the bad case scenarios, and believe me, I'm contemplating them, I don't see him pulling back on defensive weapons. I mean, even again, remember, we're talking only about a pause on offensive weapons. You had senators lining up, Republican senators, basically saying that the president is abandoning a key ally, and it could have implications for other allies around the world. I mean, the world is watching other countries. If we're saying, we're going to put a dent in this ironclad alliance, what does it mean for other countries? Can you rely on America? Are they that dependable state?
And what about the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu? He says that Israel will stand alone if it has to. Can it really, though, stand alone? I mean, how far can it push this war without its most important ally?
Right. Well, the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, are heavily dependent on the United States for weapons. $3.8 billion a year they receive in military assistance. I think Bill, right here, he's kind of channeling Machiavelli a little bit, and he's just saying to himself, you need to treat your enemies generously or destroy them altogether, because if you injure them only slightly, they'll come back to seek revenge, and if you don't, they won't be able to. And I think he sees Sinwar really as a kind of fight to the finish, and maybe he's hoping, I don't know, in his calculation, that President Biden won't even be the U.S. president in a couple of months.
Yeah, I want to pick up on that. I mean, what is at stake for Joe Biden domestically right now, particularly if he holds a red line with Israel?
Well, it's a very tricky pivot for Biden because he has been the most pro-Israel president in U.S. history, and he's been accused of, being Genocide Joe. And then you have the folks who were happy with his support for Israel saying, hey, you were way to go, Joe, and where are you now? They're saying that he's kind of he's first was talking about the two-state solution, and now it's a two-face solution. There are two Bidens, the one who gave that tremendous speech just a few days ago about the rise of anti-Semitism, and then the Joe Biden who said no more offensive weapons. I would argue that he's more of a Father Abraham figure, and he sees both Palestinians and Israelis as his children who are fighting, and he's a man of tremendous empathy. And it's just hard on him to watch the images coming out of Gaza where so many civilians are dying, and he cares deeply. I saw him wipe a tear from the corner of his eye when he talked about visiting Israel in the days in the aftermath of October 7th and seeing a picture of an Israeli mother burned to death while she was tied together with her daughter. I mean, this is real, and I do think that a lot of this, he is motivated by politics, but also by the personal as well.
Yeah, that's a very good point. We want to remind our viewers, you're a best-selling author. You've written a book about revenge for acts of violence. So I want to ask you, what strikes you about the way Israel is pursuing its war against Hamas for the attacks of October the 7th?
Well, I think what's really interesting is, immediately following October 7th, President Biden said, you need to learn from our mistakes in Afghanistan and not kind of follow our path. But what he seems to be advocating for now, if you watched his interview on CNN, he said, we wanted to get bin Laden and we can help you get Sinwar. So in an interesting way, the president is advocating for personal revenge rather than military retaliation. It's an interesting pivot.
Yeah, that's an interesting point that you bring up. You were a policy advisor to the U.S. State Department on Middle East and the peace process. So let me ask you, do you see a path for the end of the war in Gaza? And do you think the two-state solution still has any life left in it?
Well, I think it's going to take a lot of diplomatic finesse and, frankly, a lot of emotional intelligence. This war, it hasn't been a world war, but all of us, the whole world has been at war emotionally because of the impact of social media. I think one way that you can get the Israelis to kind of look more toward a two-state solution is rather than framing it as an opportunity of normalization with Saudi Arabia, which of course is important. Right now, I think they do want to just clobber somebody. If you frame it as a fight against Iran, and talk about this kind of coalition of coexistence to push back on the axis of resistance, that is a point on the horizon I could see the Israelis aiming for right now, given their emotional state. And you have to take into account the Palestinian trauma as well. It is unprecedented, and so we need to kind of move forward delicately.
Laura Blumenfeld joining us tonight from Washington, D.C. Laura, we appreciate your time and your analysis tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.